How y'all doing today? It's Global Politics with Jim Martin. You may have heard in the news lately about far-right parties in Europe and how they're kind of gaining steam in some places, most recently in Austria, and I'll talk about that here in a second. A little bit of history about this is that after World War II, for obvious reasons, folks were really not enamored of far-right parties in any way, shape, or form, with fascism in Italy and Nazis in Germany. The far right had a kind of a bad reputation. For decades, you would see kind of after World War II, all of the party systems had been disrupted, and many of the countries were, in Western Europe anyway, were coming to grips with democracy. And what emerged from that in, the late 50s, early 60s is generally a constellation of parties within most of those countries that featured a communist or left-wing party of some sort that usually would get something like 5 to 10% of the vote. Then you'd have a couple of center parties, a center left, a social democratic party that might be a little bit further left, maybe a little bit further towards the center, and usually a centrist party and a right-wing party of some kind. The differences between the ones at the center, which tended to get the most votes by far in most of these elections, would be more or less the same, and then they would kind of switch off here and there over the years. The ascendance of the EU, and perhaps more of a catalyst, the 2007 to 2010-ish financial crisis, really helped gel a more robust far-right movement in Europe, mostly due to folks who oppose the EU. There's a lot to like about the EU in some ways. There's a lot not to like. I saw something years ago that compared the US Constitution, which is something like this thick, to the EU Constitution, which was written by a passel of lawyers from all of those countries, and it's about like that and growing. There's just a lot in it that many people feel, suppresses initiative, removes sovereignty of peoples, doesn't take a lot of things into consideration that affect ordinary folks. Therefore, the far right kind of seized on this. If you look at all of the far-right parties in Europe, the one thing that they are most unified on is their opposition to the EU. Otherwise, they tend to have a variety of different kinds of motivations. For instance, many of them are xenophobic and indeed even racist, and some have various fascist sorts of leanings. But some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them, I don't know that it's proper to call them far right or extreme right or fascist. A lot of people outside of Europe kind of lump that together. So anyway, when these parties started to emerge, they were all small at first and nobody paid much attention to them, and they kind of ridiculed them a lot. But they've been growing steadily over the years. The waves of immigration and refugees that were the result of the civil wars in Syria and so forth, as well as the Ukraine war, have kind of, continued to feed them in terms of the support that they get. The best known ones today are in Poland, a party called the Law and Justice Party, or PIS, the AfD in Germany, Alternative for Germany, and a party that most recently has been in the news, the Freedom Party, or FPO, in Austria. PIS is known for nearly kind of toppling a lot of democratic institutions in Poland. And then about a year and a half ago, they lost a pretty momentous election and were soundly defeated. In Germany, the AfD has, I mentioned, been growing steadily. And due to the nature of the German electoral system and the way that it's organized, the AfD has had quite a bit of success at lower regional levels of government, city councils, regional councils, these sorts of things. Most recently, they had done quite well in 2 German states, there are 13 of them, at those regional elections, which could bode poorly for the center-left, center-right parties that have governed Germany for decades and decades. In Austria, it's somewhat of a different situation in that the FPO has been around for quite some time. The first time, they were quite successful and ended up being in a position to bargain for cabinet seats. And we're going to get to that in a minute. It's very different from how we do things here in the United States. So they ended up in government, right? However, within a couple of months, their party itself, the cabinet ministers within the government had this huge fight. And over what, I can't remember. But they had this fight, and I believe it may have even been a physical fight, which ended up with the party splintering into two different parties. And I don't remember which one got to keep FPO and which one had to do something else. But anyway, that forced new elections. And so then they just disappeared because they looked like idiots. A few years later, they were poised to also be in a cabinet. But then there was a scandal because the head of their party was taking bribes from Russian FSB people and trying to buy newspapers and colluding with the Russians. And that didn't look so good for them. So they kind of fell on hard times again. However, the economic conditions in most of Europe and particularly in Austria have kind of driven people to look at the FPO again. So just a few days ago, they had elections and the FPO got the most votes of all the parties in the Austrian legislative elections. Now, what does that mean? And I've put up a table that shows those results here. I think the FPO got something like 29%. The other parties got somewhat less than that. However, the FPO did not get 50% or more of the votes. They only got that 29%. They got the most, but most of the people in Austria voted for different parties. So therefore, you have to have a coalition government. And you've probably heard this term, and this is where it comes from, is that most European countries use proportional representation or a very close representative modification of that system where I go to the polls, I get a ballot, it's got a bunch of parties on it, not people, and I vote for my favorite party. So therefore, the number of seats that you get in the legislature or parliament is the percentage that is tallied up nationally. Kind of a cool thing. So that's one of the reasons why you see 3 or 4 or 5 parties is because you can't have them. So in this particular case, the FPO, who is absolutely hated by everyone else, particularly the leader of the FPO, who's a very unsavory sort, they'd have to go into coalition with somebody else, and all the other parties are like, hell no, we're not doing that, because of the kind of people that are at the top leadership of this party. So it's going to be a rough go for them. So I imagine that right now there are negotiations going on. However, generally speaking, in most of these countries, and I'm not quite sure if I remember how Austria handles it, is that after an election occurs, you have some window of time during which you can have these negotiations. And then someone, usually a president, or in some other places, a king or a queen, serves the role of saying, okay, your time's up to have these negotiations. Can you form a new government yet? If the FPO cannot form a new government as the leading vote getter, then they pick the next party down and ask them to try to form a government. And in this particular case, the likely outcome is that the FPO will not be able to put together a government, and therefore they'll have to turn the reins over to the next party, who will form a coalition of centrist, right, and perhaps the Green Party there. And the FPO will be shut out. That's the trouble for these parties, is they just can't get enough votes to put themselves in the driver's seat, and they're not moderate enough to be considered as possible coalition partners for any of these other parties. It makes it very difficult to foresee anything happening that's really any different really in any of these countries, including Germany, for quite some time. AfD, for instance, has some individuals in it who've been associated with a botched coup attempt with a former member of the really old German royal family. AfD has also had some folks in it, as has FPO, who are Holocaust deniers, or who at least say, that was so long ago, and we need to wipe that stain from what we've done and just forget about it. It's in the past. And it has nothing to do with how we're going to run things. And people who have some admiration for folks like Viktor Orban, who is quite clearly kind of installed himself as an autocrat in Hungary. So all of these things make regular people in these countries really kind of nauseous. So therefore, it's very unlikely that they'll ever be able to get into power unless they moderate those positions and get rid of some of those nutbag guys. If you enjoy this kind of content, please subscribe. It really helps me out. And, likes, comments, shares are definitely welcome. So thank you very much. Hope you have a great day. Appreciate it. Bye.